Chapter 9. A Close Call. They had made half the distance to the village. Hopes were running high when something occurred that threatened disaster. Far up on the side of the hill, along the base of which they were traveling, there stood here and there a clump of scraggly, wind-torn fir trees. Suddenly there appeared from out one of these clumps of scrub trees a gray streak. Another appeared, then another, and another, until there were 6. They did not pause at the edge of the bush, but rushed with swift gliding motion down the steep hillside, and their course led them directly toward the little caravan. 6 gaunt gray wolves they were, a pack of brigands in the Arctic desert. Perhaps Marian, who rode on the last sled, saw them first. Perhaps Adelat the native did. At any rate, before she could scream a warning to him, he had slapped his reindeer on the back, and the sled on which Marian rode shot forward so suddenly that she was nearly thrown from her seat. In driving in the North they do not travel single file, but each deer runs beside the sled of the one before it. The driver, who is to occupy the foremost position, chooses the best trained reindeer and attaches 2 reins to his halter that he may guide him. The drivers who follow use but one rein. By jerking this they can cause the reindeer to go faster, but they have no power to guide him. He simply trots along in his place beside the other sled. Marian had thought this an admirable arrangement until now. It left her free to admire the sharp triangles of deep purple and light yellow which lay away in the distance, a massive mountain range whose tops at times smoked with the snow of an oncoming blizzard. Or, if she tired of this, she might sit and dream of many things as they glided over the snow. But now, with a wolf pack on their trail, with the nearest human habitation many miles away, with her reindeer doing his utmost to keep up with the racing lead deer, that slender jerk line with which she could do so little seemed a fragile lifeline in case of emergency. With wrinkled brow she watched the pack, which now had made its way down the hillside and was following in full cry on their trail. They were not gaining, her heart was cheered by that. At least she did not think they were. Yet, yes, there was one, a giant wolf, a third larger than his fellows, outstripping the others. Now he appeared to be 10 yards ahead of them, now 20, now 30. The rest were only holding the pace of the reindeer, but this one was gaining, and there was no mistaking that. She shivered at the thought. It was a perilous moment, and she felt so helpless. She longed to urge her deer to go faster. She could not do that. He was keeping his place with difficulty. She could only sit and hope that somehow the wolf leader would tire of the chase. Even now she was not sorry they had come, but it was unfortunate, she thought, that there were no rifles on their sleds. Adelat had taken with him only an old-fashioned native lance, a sharp steel point set upon a long wooden handle. That was all the weapon they had, and foot by foot, yard by yard, the gaunt gray marauder was coming closer. Marian fancied she could hear the chop-chop of his frothing jaws. Then suddenly came catastrophe. With the mad perversity of his kind, her sled deer, suddenly turning from his position beside the sled, whirled about in a wide, sweeping circle which threatened to overturn her sled and leave her alone, defenseless against the hungry pack. It was a terrible moment. Gripping the ropings of the sled with one hand, she tugged at the jerk rein with the other. "It's no use," she cried in despair. "I can't turn him." One glance down the trail turned her heart faint. Her sled deer was now racing almost directly toward the oncoming pack. The gray leader was not 100 yards away. In desperation she threw herself from the sled, and grasping at some dwarf willows as she slid, attempted to check the career of the mad deer. Twice her grip was broken, but the third time it held. The deer was brought round with a wrench which nearly dislocated her shoulder. And now the deer for the first time scented danger. With a wild snort he turned to face the oncoming foe. A large deer, with all his scraggly antlers, might hold a single wolf at bay, but this deer's antlers had been cut to mere stubs that he might travel more quickly. With such weapons he must quickly come to grief. It was a tragic moment. Marian searched her brain for a plan. Flight was now out of the question, yet defense seemed impossible. There was not a weapon on her sled. Suddenly her heart leaped for joy. The fight was to be taken from her hand. Ad-loo-at, with the faithful oversight which he exercised over those entrusted to his care, having seen all that had happened, had whirled his deer about, tied it to Lucile's sled, and now came racing over the snow. He swung above his head the trusty native lance, which meant defeat to so many wild beasts in the days of long ago. But what was this? Instead of dashing right at the enemy, the Eskimo boy was coming straight for the reindeer, and on the opposite side from that on which the wolf was approaching. "He doesn't see the leader," Marian groaned. "He thinks the rest of the pack are all there are." But in another second she knew this to be untrue, for stooping low, the boy appeared to go on all fours as he glided over the snow. He was stalking the wolf even as the wolf was stalking the deer. Realizing that the wolf was planning to attack the deer and not her, Marian set herself to watch a spectacle such as she would seldom witness in a lifetime. She had often seen the antics of the Eskimos and the Chukche hunters as they performed in the Kosgei common workroom during the long Arctic nights. She had seen them go through this gliding motion which Ad-loo-at practiced now. She had seen them turn, leap in the air, and kick as high as their heads with both feet, landing again on their feet with a smile. She had admired these feats, which no white boy could do, but had thought them only a form of play. Now she was beginning to realize that they were part of the training for just such emergencies as this. Now her eyes were on the wolf and now on the boy. As the wolf approached, she cringed back to the very end of her jerk line. She saw his red tongue lolling, heard the chop chop of his iron jaws, and caught the wicked gleam of his eyes. The boy appeared to time his pace, for he came on more slowly. The deer, still facing the wolf, gave forth a wild snort of rage. He appeared to be unconscious of the fact that he was as defenseless as his driver. Now the wolf was but a few yards away. Suddenly pausing, he sprang quickly to the right, to the left, then to the right again. Before the deer could recover his bewildered senses, the wolf leaped full for his side. But someone else had leaped too. With a marvelous spring, the Eskimo boy landed full upon the reindeer's back. Coming face to face with the surprised and enraged wolf, he poised his lance for the fatal throw. But at that instant, with a bellow of fear, the deer bolted. In wild consternation, Marian tugged at the skin rope. In another moment she had the deer under control and turned to witness a battle royal. The Eskimo had been thrown from the deer's back, but agile as a cat, he had landed upon his feet and had turned to face the enemy. He was not a moment too soon, for with a snarl of fury the wolf was upon him. For a fraction of a second the lance gleamed. Came a snarl, half of rage, half of fear, as the wolf fell backwards, but he was on his feet again. It was to no purpose. All was over in an instant. Long practice with the lance had given the boy the power to baffle his enemy and send the lance straight to the wild beast's heart. "Come." Marian was startled by the sound of his voice at her side. She had managed to retain her hold on the jerk rein. She now felt it being taken from her, knew that she was being lifted onto the sled, and the next moment sensed the cool breeze that fanned her cheek. They were racing away to join Lucile and to continue their journey. As she looked back, she saw the cowardly pack snarling over the bones of their fallen leader, and realized that all danger was past, settled down into her place with a sigh as she said, "That that was a very close one." "Too much close," Ad-loo-at smiled back. "In north we must go. How you say it? Pre prepared," supplemented Marian. "We'll never travel again without rifles." "Oh, yes, maybe," the boy smiled back. "Maybe all right. Maybe rifle miss fire." "Him never miss fire." He patted first his lance, then the muscles of his strong right arm. "Better prepared think mine." Marian smiled as the brown boy ran ahead to free his own deer and prepare to continue the journey. Surely, she thought, physical fitness is a great thing. The boy has paid us well for fighting his battles for him on Puget Sound. No further adventures befell them on their journey, but it was with thankful hearts that they saw the familiar outlines of the village at East Cape. As the reindeer came to a stop, they sprang from their sled, but Ad-loo-at made no move to follow them. "Me, I go back," he said gravely. "You safe, I no stay." "But you must rest and eat," remonstrated Lucile. "And the reindeers, they need rest." "Huh!" came the answer with a shrug. "Better time to rest when all work is done. Me young, reindeers young. We rest at camp." "But you must wait till well, there is something that you." Lucile fumbled for the right words. She sensed that the boy, for all his youth, had a grown up way of looking at things. There was that talisman she had carried ever since that night he had left them there on the island of Puget Sound, the 3 elk teeth set with jade and an uncut diamond. "Don't let him go, Marian, until I come back." She darted into their igloo, to return an instant later, the odd jewel gleaming in her hand. At sight of it, a smile spread over Ad-loo-at's face. "Tch!" he chuckled. "You must take it back," Lucile demanded. The boy threw back his head and laughed boisterously. "It is a charm," he said. "Can one Chukche take back a charm? It will keep you what you say safe, yes. Me, I have this." He held up his lance. "But you must," urged Marian in return. "Must? Hear you that, reindeer? Hi-ya! Let us go." He waved his lance aloft in farewell. "Hey-ya! Mush!" he commanded, and the 3 reindeer broke into the untiring stride that would soon carry them from sight. The 2 girls stood watching him till, with a last wave of his hand, he disappeared around a hill. Then, alone again, they thought of Phi. "I wonder if he has gone on without us," said Marian. "I wonder. No, there he is!" exclaimed Lucile. "He's coming down the hill to meet us." Are we too late?" Lucile faltered as he reached their side. "About 6 hours, I should say," Phi grinned. "6 hours?" "His Nibs, the old Chukche guide, left for Cape Prince of Wales and all suburban points some 6 hours ago. Some one offered him more money than I did. I have a fancy it was your friend, the bearded miner, who wanted my mail." "And you waited for us?" "Naturally, since the guide left." "But you could have gone sooner." "Some 3 days, I'm told." "But you didn't?" He smiled and shrugged his shoulders. Marian's head whirled. She was torn between conflicting emotions. Most of all she felt terribly ashamed. Here was a boy she had not fully trusted, yet he had given up a chance to escape to freedom and had waited for them. "I beg your pardon," she said weakly. She sat down rather unsteadily on the reindeer sled. "We couldn't help it," she said presently. "They just wouldn't bring us back. Isn't there some other way?" "I've thought of a possible one. I'll make a little try out. Be back in an hour." Phi was off like a flash. A few minutes later the girls thought they heard him calling old Rover, who had been left in his care. "Wonder what he wants of him," said Lucile. "I don't know," said Marian. "But I do know I'm powerful hungry. Let's go find something to eat." End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. Finding the trail. "I think we can go." Phi smiled as he spoke. His hour for a tryout had expired. He was back. "Can we cross the straits?" Marian asked, breathless with emotion. "I think so." "How?" "Got a new guide. I'll show you. Be ready in a half hour. Bring your pictures and a little food, not much. Wear snowshoes. Ice is terribly piled up." He disappeared in the direction of his igloo. Marian looked about the cozy deerskin home where were stored their few belongings, then gazed away at the masses of deep purple shadows that stretched across the imprisoned ocean. For a moment courage failed her. Perhaps, she said to herself, it would be better to try to winter here. But even as she thought of this, she caught a vision of that time when she and her companion had been crowded out of a native village to shift for themselves. Then, too, she thought of the possible starving time in the spring, after the white bear had gone north and before walrus would come or trading schooners. "No," she said out loud. "No, we'd better try it." When the girls joined Phi on the edge of the ice floe, they looked about for the guide, but saw none. Only Rover barked them a welcome. "Where's the guide?" asked Lucile. "You'll see. Come on," said the boy, leading the way. For a mile they traveled over the solid shore ice. They then came to a stretch of water, dark as midnight. At the edge of this was a two-seated kayak. Phi motioned Lucile to a seat. Deftly he paddled her across to the other side. It was with a sinking feeling that she felt herself silently carried toward the north by the gigantic ice floe. Marian and the dog were quickly ferried over. Then, after drawing the kayak upon the ice, the boy turned directly north and began walking rapidly. At times he broke into a run. "Have to make good time," he explained, as he snatched Marian's roll of sketches from her hand. "Got to get the trail." They did make good time, alternately running and walking. They kept up a pace of some 6 or 7 miles an hour. "Why, I thought we were going to go east," puffed Marian. "We're just going down the beach." Phi did not answer. They had raced on for nearly an hour when they suddenly came upon a kayak drawn up as theirs had been on the ice. "Ah, I thought so," said the boy. "Now's the time for a guide. Here, Rover." He seized the dog by his collar and set him on the invisible trail of the men who had deserted that kayak. The dog walked slowly away, sniffing the ice as he went. His course was due east. The three followed him in silence. Presently his speed increased. He took on an air of confidence. With tail up, ears back, he sniffed the ice only now and then as he dashed over great flat pans, then over little mountains of broken ice, to emerge again upon flat surfaces. Marian understood, and her admiration for Phi grew. He had found the trail of the men who had crossed the straits before them. He had put Rover on that trail. Rover could not fail to follow. The trail was fresh, only 7 hours old. Rover could have followed one as many days old. "Good old Rover," Marian murmured. "Good old Rover, a white man's dog." All at once a question came to her mind. They had been obliged to go several miles north to pick up the trail. This was due to the movement of the ice floe. This movement still continued. It was carrying them still farther to the north. The Diomede Islands, halfway station of the straits, were small. They offered a goal of only 2 or 3 miles in length. If they were carried much farther north, would they not miss the islands? She confided her fears to Phi. "I thought of that," he smiled. "There is a little danger of that, but not much, I guess. You see, I'll try to time our rate of travel and figure out as closely as I can when we have covered the 18 miles that should bring us even with the islands. Then, too, old Rover will be losing the trail about that time. When that bearded friend of yours and his guide leave the floe to go upon the solid shore ice of the islands, The floe is going to keep right on moving north. That breaks the trail, see? When we strike the end of that trail we can go due south and hit the islands. If the air is at all clear, we can see them. It's a clumsy arrangement, but better than going it without a trail." Marian did see, but this did not entirely still the wild beating of her heart as she leaped a yawning chasm between giant up-ended cakes of ice, or felt her way cautiously across a strip of newly formed ice that bent under her weight as if it were made of rubber. It was a strange wild thrill that she realized they were far out over the conquered sea. Hundreds of feet below was the bed of the Bering Straits. Above that bed a wild, swirling current of frigid salt water raced. Once as they were about to cross a stretch of new ice, Phi threw himself flat and hacked a hole through the ice. Water bubbled up while Marian caught the wild surging rush of the current. For a second her knees trembled, her face blanched. Phi saw and smiled. "Never fear," he exclaimed. "We'll make it all right. And when you get back home you'll have a story to tell that will make Eliza's crossing on the ice seem like a picnic party crossing a trout stream on stepping stones." It was not long after that, however, when even this daring boy's face sobered. Old Rover, who had been following the trail unhesitatingly, suddenly came to a halt. He turned to the right, sniffing the ice. Then he turned to the left. After that he looked up into the face of the boy as if to say, "Where's the trail gone?" Phi examined the ice carefully. "Been a sudden jam here," he muttered. "Then the ice has slid along, some north, some south. It has all happened since our friends passed this way. You just wait here. I'll take Rover over to the north and let him pick up the trail. When I find it, I'll come back far enough to call you. Maybe to the south, though. But we'll soon see." He disappeared around a giant ice pile and in a twinkling was lost to their view. The two girls, placing their burdens of food and Marian's sketches on an up-ended ice cake, sat down to wait. They were growing weary. The strain of the adventure into this puzzling, unknown ice field was telling on their nerves. "I wish we were safe at Cape Prince of Wales," sighed Marian. "Yes, or even East Cape," said Lucile. "I think I'd be content to stay there and chance the year with the natives." "Anyway, Phi's doing his best," said Marian. "Isn't he a strange one, though? Do you think he has the blue envelope?" "I don't know." "Well, I think he has." "I don't know," said Lucile sleepily. Fatigue and keen Arctic air were making her drowsy. Presently she leaned back against an ice cake and fell asleep. "I'll let her sleep," Marian mused. "It'll give her strength for what comes next, whatever that is." An hour passed, but no call echoed across the silent white expanse. Marian, now pacing back and forth across a narrow ice pan, now pausing to listen, felt her anxiety redoubled by every succeeding moment. What could have happened to Phi? Had some mishap befallen him? Had a slip thrown him into some dangerous crevice? Had thin ice dropped him to sure death in the surging undercurrent? Or had he merely wandered too far and lost his way? Whatever may have happened, he did not return. At length, with patience exhausted, she climbed the highest ice pile and gazed away to the north. The first glance brought forth a cry of dismay. A narrow lane of dark water, stretching from east to west, extended as far as the eye could see in each direction. It lay not a quarter of a mile from the spot where she stood. "He's across and can never recross to us," she moaned in despair. "No creature could brave that undercurrent and live, and there's no other way." Then, as the full terror of their situation flashed upon her, she sank down in a heap and buried her face in her hands. They were two lone girls, 10 miles from any land, on the bosom of a vast ice floe which was slowly but surely creeping toward the unknown northern sea. They had no chart, no compass, no trail to follow, and no guide. To move seemed futile, but to remain where they were meant sure disaster. As if to complete the tragedy of the whole situation, a snow fog drifted down upon them, blotting out the black ribbon of water and every ice pile that was more than a stone's throw from them. It swept on to the south with a silence that was more appalling than had been the grinding scream of a tidal wave beneath the ice. "Lucile! Lucile!" she fairly screamed as she came down to the surface of the pan. "Lucile, wake up! We are lost! He is lost!" What had happened to the young college boy had been this. He had hastened to the north in search of the trail. Rover, with nose close to the ice, had searched diligently for the scent. For a long time his search had been unrewarding, but at last, with a joyous bark, he sprang away across an ice pan. The boy followed him far enough to make sure that he had truly found the trail, then calling him back, turned to retrace his steps. Great was his consternation when he discovered the cleavage in the floe. Hopefully he had at first gone east along the channel in search of a possible passage. He found none. After racing for a mile, he turned and retraced his steps to the point where he had first come upon open water. From there he had hurried west along the channel. Another 20 minutes was wasted. No possible crossing place could be found. He then sat down to think. He thought first of his companions. That they were in a dire plight he realized well. That they would be able to devise any plan by which they could find their way to any shore, he doubted. Yet as he thought of it, his own position seemed more critical. The trail he had found would now be useless. He was north of the break in that floe. Land lay to the south of it. He had no way to cross. In such circumstances, the dog with his keen sense of smell, and his compass with its unerring finger, were equally useless. "Nothing to do but wait," he mumbled. So he sat down patiently to wait. And as he waited, the snow fog settled down over all. Chapter 11. Without compass or guide. It was with a staggering sense of hopelessness that the two girls on the bosom of the Arctic floe saw the snow fog settling down. "It's likely to last for days, and by that time—" Marian's lips refused to frame the words that expressed their condition when the snow fog lifted. "By that time," echoed Lucile. "But no, we must do something. Surely there is some way." Without compass or guide, Marian smiled at the impossibility of there being a solution. Unconsciously she had repeated the first line of an old song. Lucile said over the verse: "Without compass or guide, on the crest of the tide, O light of the stars, pray pilot me home." Involuntarily her glance stole skyward. Instantly an exclamation escaped her lips. "Oh, Marian, we can see them! We can!" "What can we see?" "The stars!" It was true. The snow fog, though spread over the vast surface of the ice, was shallow. The stars gleamed through it as if there were no fog at all. Wildly their hearts beat now with hope. "If we can locate the Big Dipper," said Lucile, whose astronomical research had been of a practical sort, "we can follow the line made by the two stars at the lower edge of the Dipper and find the North Star. All we have to do then is to let the North Star guide us home." This was quickly done, and in a short while they had mapped out a course for themselves which would certainly come nearer bringing them to the desired haven than would the northward drift of the ice floe. "But Phi!" exclaimed Lucile. Marian stood for a moment undecided. Should they leave this spot without him? She believed he would make a faithful attempt to rejoin them. What if they were gone when he came? Suddenly she laughed. "Rover!" she exclaimed. "He can follow our trail. If Phi comes he will have only to follow us. He can travel faster than we shall. He may catch up with us." So with many a backward glance at the gleaming North Star, the two girls set their course, south by east, a course which in time should bring them in the vicinity of the Diomede Islands. In their minds, however, were many questions. Would further tide cracks impede their progress? Would the snow fog continue? If it did, would they ever be able to locate the two tiny islands which were, after all, merely rocky pillars jutting from a sea of ice? Phi did not sit long on the ice pile under the snow fog. He was born for action. Something must be done. Quickly he was on the run. As he rushed back over the way in which he had come, something caught his eye. An immense ice pan had been up-ended by the press of the drift. It had toppled half over and lodged across the edge of a smaller cake. Now, like an ancient drawbridge, it hung suspended over the black moat of the salt water channel. The boy's quick eye had detected a very slight movement downward. As he remembered it now, the cake had made a far more obtuse angle with the surface of the pool a half hour before than it did now. Was there hope in this? Hastily he arranged 3 bits of ice on one pile, then 2 on the other. By dropping on his stomach and squinting across these, he could just see the tip of the up-ended cake. If it were in motion, the tip would soon disappear. Eagerly he strained his eyes for a few seconds. Then in disgust he closed his eyes. The cake did not seem to move. For some time he lay there in deep thought. He was searching in his mind for a way out. After a while he opened his eyes. More from curiosity than hope, he squinted once more along the line. Then with a wild shout he sprang into the air. The natural drawbridge was falling. Its point had dropped out of line. The shout died on his lips. His eyes had warned him that the channel of water was widening. If it widened too rapidly, if the drawbridge fell too slowly, or ceased to fall at all, hope would die. Moment by moment he measured the two distances with his eye, Rover sitting by his side, now and again peering up into his eyes, as if to say, "What's it all about?" Now the drawbridge took a sudden drop of a foot. Hope rose. Then again it appeared wedged solidly in place. It did not move. The channel widened a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. Hope seemed vain. But now came a sudden tide tremor across the floe. With a crunching sound the massive cake toppled and fell. The boy was on his feet in an instant. The chasm was bridged, but the cake had broken in two. Could he make it? Calling to his dog, he leaped upon the slippery surface. An ever-widening river of water flowed where the cake had split. With one wild bound he cleared it. The dog followed. In another moment they were safe on the other side. "That's well over with," the boy sighed, patting the old dog on the head. "Now the question is, how can we find our friends?" That indeed was a problem. They had covered considerable ground. The ice had been shifting. To pick up their back trail seemed impossible. An hour's search convinced him that it could not be done. He sat down in a brown study. He could not go away and leave these girls to drift north and perish, yet further search seemed futile. Just as he was about to despair, Rover began to bark in the distance. Following the sound, he came to where the dog was apparently barking at nothing. But as the boy approached, the dog shot away over the ice. "A trail," he muttered, following on. The ice was hard and smooth. A soft-skinned muckluck would leave no mark. Even the hard toes of a white bear would not scratch it. When the boy had followed for half an hour, he thought of these things and paused to consider. What if he were following the meandering trail of a lumbering white bear? And if it happened to be a trail of a human being, was it his own trail, that of the girls, or of the bearded miner and his guide? His compass would tell something. Studying his compass then, he walked forward slowly. 15 minutes of this told him that this was no white bear's trail. It went too straight ahead for that. Neither could it be his own trail, for he would have come to a sudden turn before this. One thing more was certain. The person, or persons, who made this trail were headed due south by east. They would, if they did not change their course in time, reach the vicinity of the Diomede Islands. Were they his friends, or the unfaithful guide and his party? This he could not tell. After a few moments' reflection, he decided there remained but one thing for him to do, to follow the trail. "All right, old dog," he said. "Let's see where this ends, and who's at the end. Might be an Eskimo hunter who has wandered far on the ice floe for all I know. But he'll end up sometime." Moment by moment the scent of the trail they followed grew fresher. He could tell this by the old dog's growing eagerness. At every ice pile they rounded he expected to catch sight of human figures. Would it be two men or two girls? He could not tell. Not a chance footprint in soft snow had caught his eye. When he had fairly given up hope of overtaking them, as he speeded around a giant ice pile, he came at once in sight of those he followed. So overjoyed was he at the sight of human beings that before determining their identity he shouted cheerily, "Hey there!" The figure nearest him wheeled in his track. Then with the fierce growl of a beast he sprang at the boy's throat. So taken by surprise was Phi that he made no defense. He caught a pair of fiery eyes set in a mass of shaggy hair. The next instant he felt himself crashing to the hard surface of the ice. The advantage was all with the man, larger, stronger, older. With the handicap of the aggressor, he bade fair to finish his work quickly. The native guide had passed beyond the next ice pile. Rover had followed. But the boy's college days had not been for naught. He knew a trick or two. As if stunned by the fall, he relaxed and lay motionless. Seeing this, the man took time to plant his knees on the boy's chest before moving his horny hands toward his throat. The next instant, as if thrown by a springboard, the man flew into the air. Phi sprang to his feet, his one thought of escape. Turning, he dashed around an ice pile, then another and another. But fate was not with him. Just at the moment when he felt that he could elude his pursuer, his foot struck a crevice in the ice and he went sprawling. Again the wild terror was upon him. But this time there came tearing over the ice a new wild terror, and this one his friend. Old Rover, silent and determined, sprang clean at the man's throat. The assailant went down, striking out with hands and feet and roaring for mercy. Phi dragged the dog off. "Get," he said. The man looked surly, but one look at the determined boy and the eager jaws of the dog sent him slouching away. "You're some dog," the boy laughed at the old leader. "Well now, I'll say you are." Chapter 12. What is that? When the man had gone, Phi sat down upon an up-ended ice cake to rest and think. His logical course was evident enough. To wait for perhaps half an hour, allowing the man, who would doubtless be able to overtake his guide, to get a sufficient distance ahead to prevent any further unpleasant encounters. Still, he was glad now to have his rifle, as small as it was. He brought only a few cartridges for it, as they were an added weight. These had been spilled from his pocket in the scuffle, but by a diligent search he had been able to find 5. He was about to abandon the search when, with an exclamation of astonishment, he sprang forward and bending, picked up an envelope. "The blue envelope!" he exclaimed. "My envelope! He must be the bearded miner the girls told me about." It was lucky he tried to assassinate me after all." The envelope had been torn open, but the letter, though blurred with grime and dirt, was still in it. With eager fingers he pulled it out. "Couldn't read our cipher, so he was going to Nome for help, I reckon," he muttered. "All I've got to say is, it's lucky he lost it and I found it." He read the missive hastily, then a light of hope shone in his eyes. "If only I can make it back to the American shore," he exulted. "Rover, old boy, get back on your job. We're going to the islands." Hopefully he hurried forward, but they had tarried too long, for not 100 rods from their starting point they came upon a broad, dark break in the ice floe, such a break as no drawbridge of ice would ever span. And, like the other, it's endless, Phi groaned, as his eye swept the line from left to right and from right to left again. Then he sat down to think. A half hour before this Lucile had said to Marian, "Listen, I think I hear a dog bark." They listened and the bark came to them very distinctly. "Is it Rover, or does it come from the island?" asked Lucile. "I can't tell," whispered Marian. For some time they listened. When at last they prepared to resume their journey, Lucile glanced upward again. Then a cry of consternation escaped her lips. The fog had thickened. The stars were lost to them. They were again adrift on the trackless floe, without compass or guide. At the moment when Phi sat down to think, they were just coming in sight of that same break in the floe, on the side of which he sat. They were not a mile apart, but the distance had as well been 100 miles, as, in this labyrinth of ice floes, no person finds another, and, as it turned out, Phi took the trail to the left and they the one to the right. When the two girls chose to travel to the right along the break, they could not have told why, nor why they traveled at all, unless because motion quieted their nerves and served to allay their fears. Perhaps there was something of providence in it. Certainly it did bring them a bit of good fortune. Lucile had rounded a gigantic ice pile when suddenly she gripped Marian's arm. "What's this?" she exclaimed. A brown object lay some distance ahead of them. With bated breaths they crept cautiously forward. It might be a bear or a walrus. Suddenly Marian threw up her head and laughed. "It's only a kiak. Some Eskimo has left it on the ice and the floe has carried it away." "Maybe a valuable find. Let's hurry," exclaimed Lucile. Breaking into a run, they soon reached its side. "Let's explore it," whispered Marian. "You take the forecastle, I'll take the after cabin." She laughed as she thrust her arm into the open space toward the stern of the kiak. "Why, there's something there!" she exclaimed. "Something here, too," answered Lucile excitedly, as her slender white hand tugged away at a bundle which had been thrust into the prow of the boat. "It's like going through your stocking Christmas morning," laughed Marian, for a moment quite forgetting their dilemma in the excitement of discovery. Marian drew forth a large sealskin sack. It was heavy and tied tightly at the mouth. It gave forth a strange plop as she turned it over. "Some sort of liquid," she announced. "Probably seal oil." With difficulty she untied the strings and opened the sack, then quickly pinched her nose. "Phew! What a smell!" "Let's see," said Lucile, dropping the bundle she had just dragged forth. "Yes, it's seal oil. That's a good find." "Why? We can't use the stuff. It must be at least a year old and rotten. Talk about Limburger cheese. Ugh!" She quickly tied the sack up again. "Well," said Lucile, "we probably won't want to use it for food, but white people as fine blooded as we have been compelled to. It's better than starving. But I was thinking about a fire. If we ever find any fuel where we're going, wherever that is," she smiled a trifle uncertainly, "we'll need some oil to help start the fire, if the fuel is damp, as most driftwood is." "Driftwood? When do we go ashore?" laughed Marian. "It's well to be prepared for anything," smiled Lucile. "Let's see what's in my prize package." Marian leaned forward eagerly while Lucile untied a leather thong. "Deerskins!" she cried exultantly. "4 of them! Enough for a sleeping bag, and wrapped in a sealskin square which will protect us from the damp." "I believe," she said thoughtfully, "that this native must have been planning a little trip up the coast. And if he was, there must be other useful things in our ark, for an Eskimo never ventures far without being prepared for every emergency." Once more they bent over the kiak, each one to search her corner. "Another sack!" cried Lucile. "A hunting sack, with matches wrapped in oiled sealskin, a butcher knife, some skin rope, a pair of boola balls with the strings, a fishing line with a hook and sinker, 2 big needles stuck in a bit of canvas. That's about all, but it's a lot." "I found a little circular wooden box," said Marian. "More food, I guess. Probably the kind you can't eat without gagging." "No," she cried after a moment. "Here's a big square of tea, the Russian kind, all pressed hard into a brick. There's enough for a dozen tea parties. Oh, joy! Here are 3 pilot biscuits." "Pilot biscuits!" Lucile danced about on the ice. These large brown disks of hardtack, so often despised, would not have been half so welcome had they been solid gold. "Well, I guess that's about all." But Marian smiled. "I'm hungry already, but we daren't eat anything yet. We'll save these and eat the deer meat first that we brought along." "We'll be pretty awful hungry, I'm afraid," said Lucile, "before we leave the ocean. But what worries me just now is a drink. Do you suppose we could find an ice pool of fresh water?" A short search found them the desired ice pool, and each drank to her heart's content. They then sat down upon the top of the kiak for a brief consultation. After talking matters over, they decided that the best thing they could do was to remain by the kiak until the fog cleared. It was true that the kiak, carefully managed, would carry them across the break in the floe, but once across, they would be no better off than before, since they had no way of determining directions. Furthermore, neither of them had ever handled a kiak, and they knew all too well what a spill meant in that stinging water. "Guess we'd better stick right here," said Marian, and Lucile agreed. "Now," suggested Lucile, "we'll put your middy on the paddle and set it up as a sign of distress then. Since the ice isn't piling, I think we might both sleep a little while." The flag was soon hoisted, and the girls, with the sealskin square beneath them, lay down under the deerskins and attempted to sleep. But the deerskins were not large enough to cover them, and kept sliding off. They were chilled through, and sleeping was impossible. "Lucile," said Marian at last, "I believe we could set the kiak up and bank it solidly into place, then creep into it and sleep there." "We might," said Lucile doubtfully. The kiak was soon set, and after many doublings and twistings, with much laughter, they managed to slide down into it, and there, with 2 of the deerskins for mattress and 2 for covers, they at last fell asleep in one another's arms as peacefully as children in a trundle bed. "Oh, Marian, you're too chubby," Lucile laughed as she attempted to struggle from the bean pod like bed after they had slept for some time. Their first glance at the break in the ice floe told them it had widened rather than narrowed. A look skyward showed them that the fog too had thickened. Lucile's brow wrinkled, her eyes were downcast. "Cheer up," said Marian. "You can never tell what will happen. Things change rapidly in this Arctic world. We'd better explore our ice floe, hadn't we? And don't you think we could eat a bit before we go?" Cheered by the very thought of something to be done, Lucile munched her half of the pilot biscuit and bit of reindeer meat contentedly. Then, after they had seen to it that their white middy flag was properly fastened, for this must act as a guide back to the camp, they prepared to go exploring. Armed with a butcher knife, Lucile led the way. Marian carried the fishing tackle, and about her waist were wound the strings of the boola ball. "Quite some hunters," laughed Marian. "Regular Robinson Crusoettes." Several wide circles of the camp revealed nothing but ice, the whiteness of which was relieved here and there by spots of water, black as night. "Might be fish in them," suggested Marian. "Yes, but you couldn't catch them. You can only catch tomcod through a hole in the ice." They were becoming tired and had spoken of turning back, when Marian whispered, "Down!" She pulled her companion into the dark side of an ice pile. A shadow had passed over the ice. Now it passed again, and Lucile, looking up, saw a small flock of ducks circling for a pool of water not 20 yards away. "What's the idea?" she whispered. "Boola balls. Maybe we can catch one. They come from the north, not easily scared. Can you?" "Yes, my brother showed me how to handle the boola balls. You whirl them about your head a few times, then you let them go. If the string strikes a duck's neck, it winds all about it, then the duck can't fly." With eager fingers Marian straightened out the 12 feet of double strand leather thong. "There! They're down," whispered Lucile. "You stay here. If they rise and fly away, call me." Creeping around 2 piles of ice, Marian threw herself flat and began to crawl the remaining distance across a flat pan of ice. Her heart was beating wildly, for in her veins there flowed a strain of the hunter's blood of her Briton ancestors of many generations back. Now she was 40 feet away, now 20, now 10, and the ducks had not flown. Stretching out the thong, she rose on an elbow and set the balls whirling over her head. Once, twice, 3 times, then up she sprang and with one more whirl sent the string singing through the air. The young ducks, craning their necks with curiosity, did not move until something came crashing at them, and a wildly frantic girl sprang toward them. To the duck about whose neck the string had encircled, this move was too late, for Marian was upon him. And a moment later, looking very much like the old woman who went to market with a dead gray duck dangling from her right arm, Marian returned in triumph. "Oh, Lucile," she cried, "I got him! I got him!" "Fine, you shall have a medal," said Lucile. "But how will we cook him?" "Well," said Lucile after a moment's thought, "it's growing colder, going to freeze hard. They say freezing meat is almost as good as cooking it. I don't know." "Look!" cried Marian, suddenly balancing herself at the crest of a high pile of ice. "What's all that black a little way over there to the left? It's not like ice. Do you suppose it could be an island?" "Is the ice piling there?" Lucile asked, clinging to her friend's side. "No, it isn't, so it can't be an island, for the island would stop the ice as it flows and make it pile up. But what can it be?" "We can't go over there, for we can't see our flag from there." "Yes, we can," said Marian. "I'll take off my petticoat and put it on this ice pile. We can see it from there, and when we get back here we can see the flag." This new beacon was soon established. Then with trembling and eager footsteps the girls hastened to what appeared to be an oasis in a desert of ice. Chapter 13. Strange Discoveries. It was a strange sight that met the eyes of the 2 girls as they paused halfway to the dark patch on the surface of the ice, which loomed like a giant's shadow in the snow fog. With eager feet they dashed on, leaping narrow chasms and stumbling over ice barriers in their mad rush. The revelation which came as they rounded the last pile of ice was both a surprise and a disappointment. Great heaps of ashes, piles of bottles and tin cans, frozen masses of garbage, junk of every description, from a rusty tin dipper to a discarded steel range, met their eyes. "It's a graveyard," murmured Marian, "a graveyard of things people don't want." "That some people didn't want," corrected the more practical Lucile. "Marian, we're rich." "Rich?" Marian stared. "Why, yes. Don't you see? There's an old clothes wringer. That's got a lot of wood in it. And there's an old paper bucket. That'll burn. There's a lot of things like that. It won't take any time at all to get enough wood to cook our duck." "A fire? A fire!" exclaimed Marian, jumping up and down in a wild dance. Then, seized with Lucile's spell of practical philosophy, she grasped a rusty tin kettle. "We can cook it in this. There's a hole in it, but we can draw a cloth into that, and we can scour it up with ashes." The next few minutes echoed with glad exclamations. "Here's an old fork." "Here's half a sack of salt." "Here are 2 rusty spoons." "Here's a boiler," and so it went on. One would have believed they were in the greatest department store in the land, with the privilege of carrying away anything that would fit in their kitchen and that suited their fancy. Truth was, they were rummaging over the city of Nome's vast garbage pile. That garbage pile had been accumulated during the previous year and was, at this time, several hundred miles from the city. During the long 9 months of winter, the water about Nome is frozen solid some 2 miles out to sea. All garbage and junk is hauled out upon the ice with dog teams and dumped there. When spring comes, the ice loosens from the shore and, laden with its great cargo of unwanted things, carries it through Bering Straits to haunt the Arctic Ocean, perhaps for years to come. It is moved hither and yon until time and tide and many storms have at last ground it into oblivion. The long Arctic twilight had begun to fall when the 2 girls, hungry and weary, but happily laden with many treasures which were to make life more possible on their floating palace of ice, made their way towards their camp. Besides scraps of wood enough for 2 or 3 small fires, and cooking utensils of various sorts, they had found salt, part of a box of pepper, and 6 cans of condensed milk, which had doubtless been frozen several times but had never been opened. "We could live a week," said Lucile exultantly, "even if we didn't have another bit of good luck." "Yes," said Marian slowly, "but let's hope we don't have to. I'm afraid I'd get awfully hungry." They dined that night quite happily on a third of their duck, soup made of duck's broth and condensed milk, and half of a pilot biscuit. "Oh, Marian," said Lucile, as she thought of sleep, "that kayak's so crowded when we sleep there." "Yes," said Marian thoughtfully, "it is. I wonder if we couldn't make a sleeping bag." At once needles and some sinew thread found in the native's hunting bag were gotten out. The 4 deer skins were spread out, 2 on the bottom and 2 on the top, with the fur side inside, and they went to work with a will to fashion a rude sleeping bag. Their fingers shook with the chill wind that swept across the ice, and their eyelids drooped often in sleep. Yet they persevered, and at last the thing was complete. "Are you sure it won't be cold?" said Lucile, who had never slept in a sleeping bag. "Oh, no, I know it won't," Marian assured her. "I've heard my father tell of spreading his on the frozen ground when it was 30 below zero, and sleeping snug as a possum in a hollow tree." "All right, let's try it," and Lucile spread the bag on the sealskin square. After removing their skirts and rolling them up for pillows, together they slid down into the soft, warm depths of their Arctic bed. Whispered Marian. Whispered Lucile back, and the next moment they were both fast asleep. All through the night they slept there with the Great Dipper circling around the North Star above them, and with the ice floe carrying them, who could tell where? The 2 following days were spent in fruitless hunting for wild duck and in making trips to the rubbish pile. These trips netted nothing of use save armfuls of wood which helped to add a cheery tone to their camp. Though the fog held on, the nights grew bitterly cold. They were glad enough to creep into their sleeping bag as soon as it grew dark. There for hours they lay and talked of many things, of the land to which the ice floe might eventually bring them, the people who would be living there, and the things they would have to eat. Then again they would talk of school days and the glad, good times that now seemed so far away. Of one subject they never spoke. Never once did one wonder to the other what their families were doing in their faraway homes. They did not dare. It would have been like singing "Home, Sweet Home" to an American soldier on the fields of France. The second day's tramp to the rubbish pile brought them a great surprise. They were busily searching through the piles of cans for a possible one that had not been opened, when Lucile, happening to hear a noise behind her, looked up. The next instant, with a startled whisper which was almost a cry, "Marian! Quick!" She seized Marian by the arm and dragged her around an ice pile. What is it?" whispered the startled Marian. "Bear!" At this very moment, on another section of that same vast floe, Phi lay flat on his stomach, his eye traveling the length of his rifle barrel. His brow was wrinkled. He moved uneasily, as a gambler moves who would risk all on one throw of the dice, but does not quite dare. He shook the benumbed fingers of his right hand, then gripped the rifle once more. His forefinger was on the trigger. He had arrived at a crisis. He was half starved and freezing. For 3 days now he had wandered over the vast expanse of ice pans that covered the waters of Bering Straits. During that 3 days he had secured only 2 birds. Dovekies they were, birds who linger all winter in the Arctic. These he had shared with Rover. From the moment the snow fog had settled down upon him, and the break in the ice floe had blocked his way so effectively, he had wandered about without knowing where he was going. The ice floe, constantly drifting, first this way, then that, may have carried him east, west, north, south. Who could tell where? Who could guess his position on this surface of the ocean at the present moment? A brown seal was the cause of his excitement now. The seal, lying asleep upon the ice pan before him, must weigh something like 70 pounds. This was meat enough to last him and his dog many days. He was not a good shot, and he knew it. He had wandered over the ice floes of the ocean at times with a rifle under his arm, yet never before had he stalked a seal. Only the grimmest necessity could have induced him to do so now. There was something altogether too human in those bobbing brown heads as they appeared above the water or lifted to gaze about them on the ice. But now his need and the need of the dog demanded prompt action. 2 things made a perfect shot a necessity. The seal was sleeping beside his hole. If he was not killed instantly he would drop into the hole and be lost to the hunter. And this was the last cartridge in the rifle. The 2 birds had cost him 4 shots. The seal must be secured by his last one. There seemed a certain irony about a fate which would allow him to waste his ammunition on small birds, then offer him such a prize as this, with only 1 shot to win. He knew well enough how to stalk a seal. He had watched the Eskimos do it many times. Lying flat on your stomach, you cautiously creep forward. Every moment or two you bob your head up and down in imitation of a seal awakening and looking about. If your seal is awake, since his eyesight is poor, he will take you for a member of his own species and will go back to sleep again. Knowing all this, Phi had dragged himself 100 feet across the ice without disturbing the seal. Only 50 feet remained, yet to his feverish brain this seemed too great a distance. Seeing his seal bobbing his head, he bobbed in turn, then when the seal had dozed off again, continued his crawl. He had made another 6 yards, when with a resolve he slid the rifle forward, lifted it to position, glanced steadily along its barrel, then pulled the trigger. There followed a metallic snap, then a splash. The rifle had missed fire. The seal had dropped into its pool. For a moment the boy lay there motionless, stunned by the realization that he was still without food and now powerless to procure any. Well, anyway, it was luck for the seal, he smiled uncertainly. It sure was his lucky day. Rising unsteadily, he put 2 fingers to his mouth and uttered a shrill whistle. From behind a towering ice pile, Rover, gaunt and miserable, yet unmistakably a white man's dog, and by his bearing, one time leader of the team, came limping forward. "Well," the boy said, petting the dog, "it's hard luck, but we don't eat. It's harder for you than for me, for you are old and I'm young, but somehow we'll have to manage. If only we knew, if only—" He stopped abruptly and his eyes opened wide. Off to the left of them, like a giant fist thrust through the fog, there had appeared the giant bulk of a granite cliff. "Land, Rover! Land!" he muttered hoarsely. The next moment, utterly overcome with excitement, he sank weakly to the surface of the ice pan. "This won't do," he said cheerily, after a brief period of rest. "Rover, old boy, we must be traveling. If the ice is crowding that shore, which it must be from the feel of the wind, there's a chance for us yet." Chapter 14. A Lonesome Island. After fleeing from the great white bear, the two girls crouched behind the ice pile with bated breath, expecting at any moment to see the long neck of the gigantic bear thrust around the corner of the ice pile. They longed to flee, yet not daring, remained crouched there. "Do you think he saw us?" Marian whispered. "No, he was snuffing around looking for something to eat." Marian shivered. Lucile worked her way around the ice pile to a point where she could see through a crack between the cakes. Then she motioned Marian to join her. Together they watched the antics of the clumsy white bear. "My, isn't he huge?" Marian whispered. For a time the bear amused himself by knocking rusty 10-gallon gasoline cans about. At last, seeming to scent something, he began tearing up a particular garbage pile. Presently a huge rat ran out and went scurrying away. There followed a lively chase which ended in a prolonged squeal. "He got him!" Marian shivered. The bear had moved out of their view. Cautiously they turned and made their way from ice pile to ice pile, from the rubbish heap toward camp. "I hope he doesn't get our scent and follow us," said Lucile. "They don't usually bother people much, though." In spite of her belief that the bear would not harm them, Lucile did not sleep well that night. "You can never tell what a hungry bear might do," she kept saying over and over to herself. At last, late in the night, she fell asleep and slept soundly until morning. When finally she did awake, it was with the feeling that somehow something had changed. "Land, land," something seemed to be whispering to her. It could have been nothing short of intuition which gave her this suggestion. They had been riding on the surface of a gigantic ice floe. It was perhaps 20 miles wide by 100 long. There was no sense of motion. So silent was its sweep, one might imagine oneself to be upon land. Yet as she crept quickly out of her sleeping bag, she saw at once that the motion of the floe was arrested, and off to the right she read the reason. A narrow stretch of rocky shore there cast back the first rays of the morning sun. "Marian, Marian," she called excitedly. "Land, land! An island!" There could be no questioning this great good fortune. The one problem remaining was to reach the shore of that island. They did not dare to abandon their kiak, sleeping bag and scanty supplies, for who could tell them that this was not a small uninhabited island? They had traveled many miles with the ice floe in some direction, perhaps many directions. Who could say where they were now? "The ice must be piling close to shore," Lucile said. "But we must try it. It's our only chance." After a hasty breakfast of tea and a last remaining bit of cold duck, they piled all their supplies and equipment into the kiak. Then, bidding farewell to the humble ice pan which had given them such a long ride, they began dragging the kiak toward the island. This proved a long and tedious task, requiring all the skill and strength they possessed, for the island, though scarcely 4 miles in length, had appeared to be much closer than it really was. The ice piles, too, grew rougher and more uneven as they advanced. When they neared the shore they found themselves in infinite peril, for the ice was piling. Here a huge cake 100 feet across and 8 feet thick glided without a sound, up, up into mid air, at last to crumble and fall, and here a mass of small cakes were thrown into convulsions. Pick their way as they might with greatest care, they were more than once in danger of being crushed by overhanging ice pans or of being plunged into a dark pool of water. When at length in triumph they dragged their kayak to a rocky shelf well above the trembling ice, Marian, from sheer exhaustion, threw herself flat upon the rock and lay there motionless for some time. Lucile sat beside her, absorbed in thought. At last Marian sat up. "Well, we're here," she smiled, giving her blistered hands a woeful look. "Yes," smiled Lucile, "we're here. Now where is here, and what's it like?" The two girls looked at one another solemnly for a full minute. In their larder was still a little tea, a pint bottle of weak duck soup, a half can of much frozen condensed milk, and that was all. They were on an island of which as yet they knew nothing. Above them towered great overhanging cliffs. Before them the giant ice pans rose, crumbling and creaking in mad turmoil. "Life is so strange," said Lucile at length. Then energetically, "Let's make some soup of the things we have left. Then if we can get up there we'll explore our island. We'll have 3 or 4 hours of daylight left, and if there's anything for us to eat anywhere, sooner we find it out the better." The climb to the top of the island, which they undertook an hour later, was scarcely less dangerous than had been the struggle to cross the tumbling ice floe, for this island was little more than a gigantic granite boulder rising for a distance of some 500 feet out of the sea. They crept along a narrow shelf where a slip on some pebble might send them crashing to death in the tumbling mass of ice below. They scaled an all but perpendicular wall to drag their sleeping bag and the few other belongings which they had dared attempt to carry after them by the aid of a skin rope. Then, after a few minutes' rest, they would rise to climb again. But at last, their efforts rewarded, they found themselves standing on the edge of a snow-capped plateau. "Now," said Lucile, "if there are any people living on this island, it won't be on top of it, but in some sheltered cranny down by the shore, where they are away from the sweeping winds and where they can hunt and fish." "But think what they must be like," said Marian. "They may be savages who have never seen a white man. We don't even know whether we are 100 miles from Bering Straits or 500, and neither of us has ever been on an island in the Arctic Ocean." "That," said Lucile, "has nothing to do with it. We're on one now. We can't very well go back to the ocean ice. We haven't any food. We couldn't hide on this little island if we wished to. So the best thing to do is to try to find the people, if there are any, and cast our lot with them. I once heard a great bishop say that humanity is everywhere very much the same. We've just got to believe that and go ahead." Shouldering the sleeping bag and leaving to Marian the remaining seal oil in the skin sack, the butcher knife, and the fishing outfit, she marched steadily forward on a course which in time would enable them to make the outer circle of the island. "See those piles of stones," Lucile said 15 minutes later. "Those did not just happen to be there. They were put there by men. See how carefully they are piled. The piles look tall and slim. I have heard a sea captain say that the natives of this coast in very early days, when there was warring among tribes, piled stones on high points like this to make those who desired to attack them think they were men, and that there were many warriors in the place." "Then," said Marian, catching her breath at the thought, "there must be people on this island." "Not for sure," said Lucile. "The people who piled up these rocks might merely have been living here temporarily, using the island as a hunting station. And then, even if they were living here permanently, famine and contagious diseases may have killed all of them." They trudged on again in silence. Everywhere the rocky rim of the island frowned up at them, offering no suggestion of a path down to the foot or of a rocky shelf below where a group of hunters might build a village. "There's a place somewhere," said Lucile stoutly, as she lowered her burden to the snow and paused for a brief rest. "There's a path down, and we must find it, if it's nothing more than to find a safe spot by the sea where we can fish for smelt, tomcod and flounders." Dusk was falling when at length, with a little cry of joy, Lucile sprang forward, then began a cautious descent over a winding and apparently well worn trail which even the snow did not completely conceal. With hearts beating wildly in utter silence, they made their way down the winding way to what? That they could not tell. Finally Lucile paused. She caught her breath quickly and clutched at her throat. At length, in a calmer moment, she pointed down and to the right of the trail. "See that square of white?" Marian strained her eyes to peer through the gathering darkness. "Yes," she said at last, "I see it." "That," said Lucile in a tone that was tense with emotion, "is the roof of a house, a white man's house." "What? What makes you think so?" gasped Marian. "There's nothing as square as that in nature's panorama, and a native does not build a house like that. And if it is, we must trust ourselves to their care, though I'd almost rather they were natives." She closed her eyes and saw again the rough, unkempt white men, beach combers who lived by trading, hunting and whaling with the natives. They were a hard, bad lot, and she knew it. "Well," she sighed, "come on, let's go down." Down they went, each turn of the path bringing them closer to the mysterious house. "There's no light," said Lucile at last. "There are no tracks in the snow," added Marian a moment later. "It's boarded up," said Lucile as they came closer. It would have been hard to judge whether there was more of relief or of disappointment in the tone in which she said this. They stood there staring at the house. It was a nice house, a bungalow such as one might desire for a summer home in the mountains or at the seashore. "Who do you suppose brought all that fine lumber up here and built that house?" said Lucile. "I wonder who?" echoed Marian. They took a turn about it. All the windows had been boarded up with rough lumber. There were two doors. These were fastened with padlock and chain. An examination of the locks showed that the keys had not been used in them for months. Lucile's eyes were caught by poles and some platforms to the right along the rocky shore. She walked in that direction. "Marian, come here!" she cried presently. Marian came running. "Look! Here's a whole native village. They've built their homes out of the rocks. See, it's like tunneling into the side of the mountain. Must be homes for 100 people. And not a soul here. How strange! Not even a dog!" Lucile's own voice sounded strangely hollow to her, as if echoed by the walls of a tomb. Chapter 15. Two Red Riding Hoods. Before Phi struck out for the unknown land which had so suddenly thrust itself into his line of vision, he paused to ask himself the question whether he had come upon some island or a point on the mainland. Finding himself unable to answer the question, he at once set plans for reaching that land. The rifle, now a useless encumbrance, he left leaning against an up-ended cake of ice. That shore, if not lifted high by a mirage, was at least 10 miles away. And 10 miles to a boy and a dog who have appeased their hunger for 3 days with 2 small birds is no mean distance. Bravely they struck out. Now they crossed a broad, level pan, and now climbed a gigantic pile of boulder-like fragments that rolled and slipped at their every move, threatening to send them crashing to the surface of the ice pans or to submerge them in the deep, open pool of stinging water that lay at its base. Exercising every precaution, the boy made his way slowly forward. More than once he paused to wait for the dog, time after time lifting him over a dangerous crevice or assisting him in climbing a particularly difficult barrier. "I know you'd help me if you could," he said with a smile as he moistened his cracked lips. "So if we go down, we go together." Time after time, dizzy-headed and faint, he sat down to rest, only to rise after a moment and struggle on again. At times, too, he was obliged to shake himself free from the spells of drowsiness which the chill wind and brisk Arctic air threw over him. "We will make it, old boy. We will make it," he repeated over and over. Little by little the landscape broadened before them. The bit of rugged shore line which lay there like a vision might be a point of land on the continent of North America or of Asia. Then again it might be the side of an island. Phi thought of this in a vague sort of way. His chief desire to put foot once more on something that did not drift with wind and tide, he bent every effort to making the goal. At last, after what seemed like days of struggle, he stood within a quarter of a mile of the shore. The ice was piling on that shore, a scene of disordered grandeur beyond description. It was as if the streets of a city, 6 or 8 feet in thickness and solid as marble, should suddenly begin to rise, to buckle, to glide length upon length in wild confusion. For some time the boy and the dog stood upon the last broad pan that did not pile, and lost in speechless wonder, viewed that marvel of nature with the eyes of unconcerned spectators. At last the boy shook himself free from the charm. "Rover," there was awe in his tone, "do you know what we must do? We must cross that and reach that shore before the wind shifts or we are lost." As if understanding his meaning, the dog lifted his nose in the air and sung the dismal song known only to the sled dog of the Arctic. "Well, here it goes." Phi scrambled to the surface of a gliding cake, then, having raced across its surface, leaped a narrow chasm to race on again. Such an obstacle race had never before been entered into by a boy and a dog. Rover, seeming to have regained some of the spirit of his younger days, followed well. Once with a dismal howl he fell into a crevice, but before an ice pan could rear up and crush him, a strong arm dragged him free. They had made 2/3 of the distance when, on a broad pan that shuddered as if torn by an earthquake, Phi paused. One glance at the rocky coast brought a sharp exclamation to his lips. "It's like the wall of a prison," he muttered. "Straight up!" "No," he whispered a moment later. "There's a bare chance, that rocky shelf, but it's 15 feet above the ice, and how's one to reach it? There may be a way. One can but try." They were off again. Each fresh escape brought them face to face with new and more startling dangers. Here they were lifted in the air, to leap away just in time from a crash. Here they crossed a pile of crushed and slivered fragments, only to face a dark and yawning pool of salt water, waiting to sting them into insensibility. But always there was a way out. Each moment brought them closer to the frowning wall. At last close-up survey told the boy that there was no path, no slanting incline, no rugged steps to the shelf above. But from the shelf upward there appeared to be a possible ascent. At that moment he saw something that made him catch his breath hard. A gigantic ice pan, measuring hundreds of feet from side to side, had begun to glide upward over a mass of broken fragments toward the cliff. "It will go as high as the shelf if it hasn't too many seams," he said aloud. "It may go up and it may crash, but it's our only chance." He looked at the dog. That the old fellow could make this perilous trip, could mount himself on the very edge of a giant tilting cake of ice and ride up, 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 inch by inch and foot by foot, to pause there a breathless distance in midair, and then at one critical second leap to safety on a rock shelf, the boy did not dream for a moment. Yet he had no thought of leaving Rover behind. "Come on," he said quietly. "We'll make it somehow or we'll go down together." Mounting the tilted monster, they stationed themselves at the very edge and stood there motionless, a boy and a dog, in the very midst of one of nature's most stupendous demonstrations of power. A long minute passed. 2, 3. They were now 10 feet in the air. The shelf, a yawning distance still before them, appeared to frown down upon them. To the right of them an ice pan half the size of the one on which they rode, having come within some 10 feet of the wall, broke and crumbled down with a crash. Still their cake glided on. Now they were 15 feet from the shelf, now 10. A running jump for the boy would land him safely on the ledge. But there was the dog. There came a creaking grind, a snapping, crashing sound, then silence. The pan had broken in two. Half of it had broken off under the strain. The part on which they rode still stood firm. They were now 20 feet in the air. A dark pool of water lay beneath them. The boy gave one glance at the blue heavens and the blinking stars. Then stooping, he picked up the dog and held him in his arms. He stood there like a statue, a magnificent symbol of calm in the midst of all this confusion. With the ice still gliding upward, holding his breath as if in fear that the very force of it might send the hundreds of tons crashing to the abyss below, Phi waited, the gap closing. 8 feet, 7, 6, 5, 4. Now, he breathed. His right foot lifted, his left foot stiffened, and his body shot forward. The next moment there was a sickening crash. The ice pan had broken into 1,000 pieces, but the boy and the dog, saved by a timely leap, lay prone upon the surface of the rocky cliff. For some time the boy lay sprawled upon the rocky ledge, motionless. This last supreme effort had drawn out his last reserve of nervous energy. Amid the shrill scream of grinding ice rising from the tossing mass below, he lay as one whose ears are closed forever to sound. The dog, with ears drooping, eyes intent, lay watching him. At last, his tail wagging gently to and fro, there had been a flutter of motion in the boy's right hand. Meekly the dog crawled forward to lick the glove that covered the hand with his rough tongue. At that the boy raised himself into a sitting position and rubbed his eyes, staring about him. "Rover, old boy," he drawled at last, "that was what you might call a close squeak." The dog rose and wagged his tail. "Rover," the boy said solemnly, "I took a long chance for you just then. Why did I do it? If you'd been the leader of my team for several winters before old age overtook you, if you'd maybe pulled me out of some blizzard where I'd have frozen to death if it hadn't been for your keen sense of smell, which enabled you to follow the trail, there'd have been some sense to it. But you weren't, and you didn't. You're only a poor old heroic specimen someone has played traitor to and deserted in old age. Well, that's enough of that. We're on land now. What land is it? What are these people like? When do we eat?" "The last question is most important for the moment. What say we try scaling the cliff and then look about a bit?" The dog barked his approval. Together they began scaling the cliff, which at times appeared to confront them as an unsurmountable barrier, and at others offered a gently rising slope of shale and rock. When Lucile and Marian had made sure that there were no people in the deserted native village, they returned to the mysterious bungalow. "We've got to get in there," said Marian. "Don't matter whose it is." Searching about, she found a stout pole. With this she pried off a board from a window, then another, then another. "Give me a lift," she said, raising one foot from the ground. Once boosted up, she found that the window was not locked. The sash went up with a surprising bang, and the next instant she was inside, assisting Lucile to enter. The place had a hollow sound, "like an old empty church," said Marian. Lucile scratched a match. They were in a large room which was absolutely empty. A hasty exploration of the three remaining rooms, which were much smaller, revealed the same state of affairs. "Now what," said Lucile, knitting her brows in deep thought, "do you think of that?" "Anyway, it's dry and not too cold," said Marian. "But it's empty and I'm hungry. Say," she exclaimed quickly, "you bring in our things. I'll be back." She bounded out of the window and hurried away toward the native village, which lay silent in the moonlight. Marian had succeeded in dragging their sleeping bag and other belongings through the window, and was there waiting when Lucile called from outside. "Here, take this." "How heavy!" exclaimed Marian, and a moment later, upon receiving the second object, "How cold!" "The first," said Lucile, "is a flat native seal oil lamp. We can burn our seal oil in it. I have a handful of moss in my pocket to string along the side for a wick. It'll make it more cheery and it'll seem warmer. The other," she went on, "is a frozen whitefish. Found it in one of the native caches. Guess the natives won't miss it if they come back." "If they do. But where are they?" asked Marian in a puzzled tone of voice. "Dead, perhaps. Let's eat," she added abruptly as Marian shivered. "But Lucile, we can't cook the fish." "Don't have to. Frozen fish is good raw if it's frozen hard enough. I've tried it before. You just shave it off thin like chipped dried beef and gulp it down before it tastes too fishy." Marian did not think she would like it, but found it not half bad. When they had dined and had sat by the yellow glow of their seal oil lamp for a time, they took a good long look at the moon as it shone out over the shimmering whiteness of the sea. "That," said Marian impressively, "is the same moon that is shining on all of our friends wherever they are to night." The thought gave them a deal of comfort. When in time their sleeping bag was spread out on the floor, and they had snuggled comfortably down into its soft depths and were ready to go off into the land of dreams, with their seal oil lamp still flickering in one corner, Marian said with a laugh, "Snug as two little Red Riding Hoods." "Yes, but if the big bear comes home?" murmured Lucile. "He won't," said Marian with conviction. But the next moment her faith was shattered. There came a sound from without, and the next instant some heavy object banged against the door. "What was that?" both exclaimed at once in hoarse whispers. Chapter 16. A fortunate discovery. As Phi and his dog reached the top of the cliff and were about to step upon the uneven, snow-covered tableland which lay before them, the boy's eyes chanced to light upon a strange-looking brown mass which lay on the rock beneath the shelter of a protecting ledge. "What do you suppose that is?" he said to the dog, at the same time stepping aside to examine it. "It's a net," he commented. "Too fine for a fish net, must be a bird net. That'd be good luck for us if it were summer. Place must be alive with birds then from the looks of the deserted nests. But now you're no good to us." He kicked the net contemptuously. "Tell us one thing, though," he confided to Rover. "There are people on this island, or at least have been. Natives of some kind they must be, for no white man would have the patience to make a net of sealskin as fine as that. Question is, were they just camping here to gather eggs, or do they live here? If they live here, what kind of people are they? Well, anyway, let's go see." Wearily he dragged his tired limbs up a gentle slope. Wearily the old dog followed on. But as they reached the crest the dog became suddenly alert. His ears cocked up, his legs stiff, he sniffed the air. "What's that, old fellow? Birds? You've a bit of bird dog blood in you. Lots of leaders have. But I guess you're mistaken. Not birds this late in the year." He moved forward a few feet, then his mouth flew open, but no sound came out. He had seen a white streak flit across the snow. He had. There was another and another. Slowly he backed away. Followed reluctantly by the dog, he retreated to the rocky shelf where lay the net. "We may be able to use you yet," he remarked as he picked up an end of the net. "If you're not too rotten you'll serve us a good turn. There are ptarmigan out there. Don't know how many, but enough if we catch them. Ptarmigan are good too," he smiled at the dog. "Good as quail and about as plump. Boy, oh boy, won't we feast though if only we can catch them. But," he sobered suddenly, "how I'm going to drop both ends of this net at just the right moment is more than I can tell." The net proved to be in serviceable condition. It was some 10 yards by 3 wide, and was of a finely woven mesh. 2 10-foot poles lay farther back under the ledge. One of these was quickly attached to an end of the net, then the net was wound upon it. The second stake was fastened to the remaining loose end. Carrying the net to a level stretch at the top of a ridge, he unrolled it, then for a full 5 minutes stood studying it. At last he turned thoughtfully to the right and strolled along the net. Suddenly something caught his foot and he sprawled upon the ground. Rising, he looked at the thing that had tripped him. Then a light of joy spread over his face. "Creeping willows!" he exclaimed. "The very thing!" He spent the next 3 minutes pulling at long strands of creeping willows. When he had found 2 long, strong ones, he left them still fast to the earth at one end and went for his net. One pole he set on end and proceeded to fasten it there by the aid of the creeping willows, guying it to right and left as a flagpole is often braced. He then ran out the length of his net, and having pulled it tight with the other pole perpendicular, he gave this pole a sudden pull and twist, then threw it to the ground. The net went flat. "Capital!" he cried. "That will do it." Having reset his net, he took a long circular route. He came up at last 100 yards from his fence-like net. The dog had followed meekly at his heels, but now, seeming to sense what was needed, he began rocking back and forth, first to the right, then to the left. Now and then a white spot rose a foot or two above the snow to soar forward. The boy's eyes snapped. Here was sport that meant life to him and to his dog if they won. Now they neared the net. His heart beat fast. Suppose the birds should rise and soar away, then all this work would be lost. But they still ran or fluttered forward. "Must be 8 or 10 of them," was his mental comment. Now they were nearing the net. Veering swiftly to one side, the boy raced to the reclining pole. Lifting it lightly, he drew the net into position. So white were the birds that he could scarcely distinguish them from the snow. But suddenly he caught a faint shock. A bird in low flight had struck the net. With wildly beating heart he threw the net to the snow, then went racing down its length. "Oh!" he exclaimed, fairly beside himself. "2, 3, 4!" Each time he named the count he had drawn a bird from the meshes. At last he was to the end and sank down exhausted. The dog was at his side. "Rover, old top," he murmured. "4 of 'em. 4 beauties. We eat, old top, we eat." The dog's eyes rolled hungrily, but he did not offer to touch the birds. With eager, trembling fingers the boy tore the feathers from 2 of the birds, then tossed to the dog the wings, legs and back, reserving for himself the dark, rich meat of the breasts, a food fit for a king's table. He cut this off in thin strips and spread it upon the hard-packed bank of snow. The thermometer must stand at 10 below. The thin strips would soon be frozen solid. They would then be almost as palatable as if they had been cooked. With a meal in sight, he found his mind becoming more composed. His thoughts wandered back to the question of the nature of the land he had discovered. Little knowing what lay just before him, he munched the frozen strips of flesh. Then, strengthened and heartened, he began making plans for a night on the newly discovered island. A freezing wind swept across the plateau. He must find shelter from this if he was to secure the sleep his tired form demanded. After a search he found a rocky crevice which, with the aid of some squares of snow cut from a nearby bank, he converted it into a 3-sided house, with the open side away from the wind. From the sheltered sides of the great rocks that lay tumbled about here and there, he gathered moss by the armful, and carrying it to his house, made a thick soft bed for himself and the dog. His next thought was of a fire. He had no desire to eat more raw meat. Besides, he was not unmindful of the cheering influence of even a tiny blaze. The ground was everywhere overrun with creeping willows. These he clipped off with his hunting knife and tied in bundles. Some were dry and dead. These he kept in a separate bundle. When he had an armload, he carried them to a spot near the door of his house. He had no matches, but this did not trouble him. Cutting off a foot of a pole used with the net, he split it in two pieces. One of these halves he split again, and from these smaller pieces he formed a bow and drill of an Eskimo bow drill. With a tough creeping willow runner for a string to his bow, with dry moss for tinder, he soon had first a smoke, then a blaze. Not long after this he was turning a carefully picked and cleaned fowl over a cheerful flame. Having broiled this to a turn, he shared it with the dog, then lay down to sleep. Before the sweet oblivion of sleep quieted his aching muscles, the old haunting questions came back to him. What land? What people? There were but two questions now. The third had been temporarily solved. They still had a bird for breakfast, and that there were others to be caught he did not doubt. Chapter 17. Out of the Night. After Marian and Lucile had heard the crash against the door of the boarded-up house, and had stilled their wildly beating hearts, they dragged themselves halfway out of their sleeping bags and sat up. "What was it?" Marian repeated. Her teeth were chattering so she could hardly whisper. "It saw the light from the seal oil lamp," Lucile whispered. A cold chill ran up her back. "Shh! Listen!" It was a tense moment. A dead silence hovered over the room. Had they heard a sound as of low moaning or whining, or was that the wind? "Marian," whispered Lucile, "what sort of a sound does a polar bear make?" "I don't know." Marian shivered. "Whatever it is, we're not going to open that door." I don't know." The moan came distinctly now, and a scratching sound. "Perhaps we ought. Perhaps it is some one in trouble." Lucile was silent. She hadn't thought of that. For 5 minutes they sat there listening. Not a word passed between them. Now and again there came that awful low moan and the scratching. Save for the dismal wail of the wind that had arisen and was singing about the corners of the house, there was no other sound. The seal oil lamp in the corner flickered constantly, sending a weird yellow light dancing from floor to ceiling. "Lucile," said Marian at last, "I can't stand it any longer. If it's some one in distress, they'll surely freeze, and then we could never forgive ourselves. The chain will let the door open a crack. If it's a bear or a wolf or a wild dog, he can't break the chain. If it's some one, whoever he is, even if he's drunk, we ought to help him." Lucile shivered, but she arose and fumbling about found the butcher knife. "I'll stand by with the knife." She followed Marian as they tiptoed towards the door. The moon was shining brightly through the window. Whatever was at the door, they would be able to see it once the door was open a crack. "Now." "Ready," whispered Marian as she grabbed the doorknob and turned it. With wildly beating heart, Lucile waited at her side. But the door did not open. "It's stuck," whispered Marian. I guess you'll have to help me." Reluctantly laying down the knife, Lucile put both hands over Marian's and exerted all her strength in a pull. The next instant the door gave way, but instead of being permanently held by the chain, it was only momentarily checked by it, then flew wide open, sending both girls crashing to the floor. The rusty staple had broken. Too frightened to breathe, they scrambled to their feet. Lucile fumbled about for the knife. Marian seized the door to close it. Then in one breath they exclaimed, "Why, it's only an Eskimo boy!" It was true. Before them on the snow, peering white-faced at them, was a native boy, probably not over 10 years old. He dragged himself to a sitting position, then attempted to rise. At this he failed and fell over again. "He must be injured," said Marian. "Or starved," answered Lucile. It was plain that the boy was at this time quite as much frightened as had been the girls a moment before. "We must get him inside and find out if he's hurt," said Lucile, bending over and grasping the boy by the shoulder. As she did this he uttered a low moan of fear and shrank back. Disregarding this, the two girls lifted him gently and carrying him inside, set him on their sleeping bag with the wall of the room as a prop to his back. "I believe his foot's hurt," said Lucile suddenly. "See how his skin boot is torn." To cut away the boot, which was stiff and frozen, was a delicate task. When this and the deerskin sock had been removed, they saw that the foot had been indeed badly crushed. The deerskin sock had prevented it from freezing. By carefully pressing and working at it this way and that, Lucile determined that there were probably no bones broken. It was, however, swelling rapidly. "We must bandage it at once," said Lucile. "With what?" Lucile's answer was to tear a 6-inch strip from the bottom of her underskirt. The wound was then tightly and skillfully bandaged. "Next thing is something to eat," said Lucile, rising. "You stay here and I'll see what I can find to cook something in." She soon returned with a huge brass tea kettle of the Russian type. Into this she put snow and hung it over the seal oil lamp. Soon a bit of fish was boiling. "Better warm stuff at first," she explained. "He must be nearly frozen." All this time the boy, with his look of fear gone, sat staring at them, his big brown eyes full of wonder. "I'd like to know where he came from and how it is that he's alone," said Marian. "So would I," said Lucile. "Well, anyway, we'll have to do the best we can for him. You know what it says somewhere about entertaining angels?" "Yes, and that reminds me, he must have a place to sleep. I'll go see what I can find." She returned presently with an armload of deerskins. "There's everything out there," she smiled, nodding toward the native village, "just as if they were gone overnight and would be back in the morning." "I wonder," said Marian with a little thrill, "if they will." An hour later, with a pole propped solidly against the door, with the boy slumbering soundly in the opposite corner, and the seal oil lamp flickering low, the girls once more gave themselves over to sleep. When they awoke they found the cabin encircled by a howling whirlwind of snow, one of those wild storms that come up so suddenly in the Arctic seas and as suddenly subside. The frozen fish, which was a large one, sufficed for both breakfast and dinner for the three of them. The boy, a bright little fellow with the ruddy brown cheeks of an Italian peasant boy, but with the slight squint of eyes and flatness of nose peculiar to these natives of the North, watched every move they made with great interest. They tried from time to time to talk to him, but he did not apparently know a word of English, and even to the few words of Eskimo that they knew, he gave no response. "Oh, Lucile," Marian exclaimed at last, "are we in Russia or America? Who is this boy? Where are his people?" Lucile did not reply. She was too deeply perplexed for words. But the boy, seeming to have caught something of the purport of Marian's words, tore a splinter from the wall board of the cabin, and, having held it in the blaze of the seal oil lamp until it was charred, began to draw on the floor. First he drew a large circle, then a small one. Next, on the large circle he drew lines to represent men, as children often do, a straight line for back and one each for arm and a leg, with a circle for a head. When he had drawn many of these, he drew a square within the smaller circle, and within the square drew 2 characters to represent persons. He next drew between the 2 circles many irregular figures. In the midst of this mass of irregular figures he drew a character for a person. He made a motion with his hand to indicate that the irregular figures between the circles were in motion. Next he made a motion with his charcoal pencil to indicate that the lone person was moving across the irregular figures between the circles. This motion was halting, as if the person many times stumbled and fell. The course of the charcoal had at last reached the edge of the square, and there it drew the reclining figure of a person. Lucile watched every movement intently. "Do you see what he is telling us?" she cried excitedly. "It is the old native way of telling stories by drawings. He has said by the two circles that there are two islands, one large, one small. On the large one are many people, his people. On the small one a house, the house we are in. Between the two islands there is flowing ice. A figure is attempting to cross the ice. He is that one. He falls many times, but at last reaches the island and this house." "And," said Marian, "probably the people, many of them, live on this island. They were probably over there when the ice came. They did not dare to attempt to cross. When the floe is steady and solid, as it will be after this storm, then they will cross. And then—" She paused. "Yes, and then?" said Lucile huskily. With the setting of the sun, the wind fell, the snow fog drifted away, and the moon came out. Lucile crept out of the cabin and went in search of some new form of food. She found the spare ribs of a seal hanging over a pole in one of the caches. It seemed fairly fresh, and when a piece was set simmering over the seal oil lamp, it gave forth an appetizing odor. The two girls stood by the window as the food cooked. They were looking out over the sea, which was now a solid mass of ice. "I almost believe I can catch a faint outline of that other island," said Lucile. "Yes, I think you can," said Marian. "But what was that?" She gripped her companion's arm. "What?" said Lucile. "I thought, yes, there it is, out there to the right. Some dark object moving among the ice cakes." "Yes, now I see it. And there's another and another. Yes, perhaps 20 or more. What can they be?" "Men and dogs," said Marian slowly. "The tribe is coming home." There was a little catch in her voice. Every muscle in her body was tense. They were far from their homes, not knowing where they were, and these strange people, a strange, perhaps wild tribe of savages. Then there came to Marian the words of the great bishop: "Humanity is very much the same everywhere." And for a time the thought comforted her. They remained there standing in full view in the moonlight, watching until the men could be distinguished from the dogs, until the whole company, some 50 or more people, left the ice and began to climb the slope that led to the village. But now they all stopped. They were pointing at the cabin, some of them gesticulating wildly. After a time they came on again, but this time much more slowly. In their lead was a wild-haired man, who constantly went through the weird dance motions of these native tribes. Weird, wild calisthenics they were, a thrusting out of both hands on this side, then that, a bowing, bending backward, leaping high in the air. And now they caught the sound of the witch song they were all chanting. "I am ah. I ah." As they neared the cabin, Lucile turned away. "I think," she said unsteadily, "we had better bar the door." At that she lifted the heavy bar and propped it against the door. Chapter 18. A new peril. Long hours in the cranny of the cliff, Phi was wrapped in heavy slumber. Dressed as he was in deerskin and sealskin garments, he did not feel the cold. The bed was soft, his house well sheltered from the wind. He awoke at last to start and stare. The sun was painting the peaks of distant ice piles with a touch of pink and gold. He experienced a strange sensation. For one brief moment he fancied himself on the mainland of Alaska. This, he realized, was not entirely impossible. The ice floe might have circled about to carry him near to the coast again. So possessed was he with the idea that he grew impatient at the slow broiling of their one remaining bird. Once the meal was over, having hidden the bird net in the crevice that he might return to it in case of necessity, he hurried away. With Rover at his heels, he crossed the uneven surface of the plateau, keeping well toward the edge of the rocky cliff, that he might discover a path, if there should be one, leading down to a village or a miner's cabin. In his mind's eye he pictured himself sitting down to a meal of mulligan and sourdough flapjack in some friend's mining shack, and if this dream came true, how quickly he would shape his course toward the spot he had been directed to by the ciphered note in the blue envelope. "I'd walk in on them like old Rip Van Winkle," he smiled and glanced at his dog. "You look the part of Rip's dog, old fellow," he laughed. "Surely you do." Yet as he thought more soberly, he realized that there was no reason for supposing that the ice floe had returned him to the mainland of America. "Might be a point of the mainland of Asia," he reasoned. "The people who come here hunting may be Chukches." Had his mind been less occupied with these speculations, he might have taken note of some movement off to the right of him. As it was, he walked straight on. Suddenly a small dark object flew past his head. Before he could turn to investigate, a second, better aimed, struck him in the side. Caught off balance, he went crashing to the ground. The next moment the dog gave a yelp of pain. He too had been struck by one of these flying missiles which proved to be rocks. Stunned but not seriously injured, Phi rose upon hands and knees and made all haste to fortify himself behind a massive boulder. Growling defiance, the old dog crouched by his side. It was a moment of suspense. What could this mean? In the boy's mind there crowded many questions. Had he been carried to the shore of some island to the far north, where the white man has never set foot? Was he about to be attacked by a murderous band of superstitious natives? He had seen no one. How many were there, and why did they use only stones for weapons? The bow and arrow are known to the most ignorant savage. To these questions he could form no answer. He could only crouch there and wait. He did not have long to consider what his next move should be, for a rock grazed his ear. A quick glance in the direction from whence it came showed him the form of a single native. Instantly the man vanished, but a moment later a second rock flew through the air. It came from exactly the same spot. "Maybe only one," he murmured. Encouraged by this thought, he proceeded to stalk his enemy by hurrying around the boulder and peering out at him from the other end. The ruse worked. He found the man standing in full view, craning his neck to look round the side of the rock which the boy had just left. Presently the native took a few steps toward Phi, though he walked with a kind of stagger. "It's strange he'd have the courage to attack me alone, armed only with rocks," he murmured. A yelp from the old dog roused him to action. The native's rock had found a mark. His back was turned to the boy, and with a sudden swift rush Phi leaped out and landed full upon his back. The two of them went crashing to the ground. For a moment the man struggled with almost demoniacal strength. Then suddenly he crumpled in the boy's grasp and sank lifeless to the ground. Fearing a trick, Phi turned the man over and sat upon his chest, pinning his hands to the ground. But he was unconscious. There was no mistaking that. "That's queer," perplexedly. "I didn't do anything to him that I know of. Wasn't thrown hard or anything." He bent over to gather up a handful of snow, which was to rub the native's brow, when he caught an old familiar odor. Just then the dog came limping up. "Rover, old boy," Phi smiled a queer sort of smile. "We're not beyond the reaches of the civilized white man. This fellow's drunk. Hooch. In other words, moonshine. I smell it on his breath. That's why he was throwing stones at us. Crazy drunk, that's all. Now he's gone dead on us like a flivver run out of gas." The dog smelled of the man and growled. "Don't like it, do you? Most honest men and dogs don't. Moonshine's no good for anybody. And now, just for that, we're in something of a task. This fellow'd lie here until he froze stiff as a mastodon tusk if we let him. But we can't afford to let him, even if he did pelt us with rocks. We've got to get him on his feet somehow, and make him walk the dog till he sweats some of that hooch out of him." As he looked the man over for a knife which might prove dangerous once he was aroused from his stupor, Phi realized that he was not on the mainland of America. This man's costume was quite unlike that of the Diomeders. He wore a jacket of eiderduck skin such as was never seen on little Diomede, and his outer garments of short-haired deerskin, instead of being composed of parka and trousers, were all of one piece. "Wherever we are," he said to the dog, "we'll know what's what in an hour or two." After witnessing the strange actions of the group of natives as they clustered in about the boarded up house, with wildly beating hearts Lucile and Marian took their places back a little in the shadows, where they could not be seen but could still watch the wild antics of their strange visitors. "What does it mean?" whispered Marian. "I can't even guess," Lucile whispered back. "Something terrible, though, I am sure." By this time the entire group was circling the house, and their wild, shrill, cadent song rose high and loud. Ki-yi-yum-ah-ah-ah, The single dancer tore his hair again and again, and repeated his mad gesticulations. Only one figure stood back impassive, not singing and not taking any part in the weird demonstration. Suddenly, at a sign from the wild-haired leader, all the singing ceased. He uttered a few words apparently of command, then waved his scrawny arms toward the house. A wild shout rent the air. All the natives, save the impassive one, sprang to their feet and started toward the village. But now the impassive one leaped up and tried to check them, to drive them back. As well attempt to stop a torrent with an open hand. They pushed him aside and hurried on. The next moment the girls heard a pounding at the door, but dared not open it. "What does it mean? What can it mean?" they kept asking one another. Presently the mad group came racing back. Some bore on their shoulders poles and boards hastily torn from their caches. Two others were staggering under a load, which appeared to be a sealskin filled with some liquid. "Seal oil," said Lucile. "What?" And then the full meaning of it came to her like a flash. "Marian," she said in almost an inaudible whisper, "they mean to burn the cabin. That's what the wood and seal oil are for, to start the fire." The words were hardly out of her mouth when Marian gripped her arm. "Look!" she cried. A dense black smoke was rolling past the window. Roused by her cry, the crippled Eskimo boy sprang up upon his one well foot and came hopping toward them. One look at the smoke, at the madly dancing old man, and he hopped for the door. Throwing the pole to the floor, he hopped outside and away. "He's gone! Deserted us!" "What does it matter now?" Lucile covered her face with her hands. "But look!" cried Marian. The boy had hopped out into the howling, dancing circle. The howling had ceased. He had tumbled to a sitting position on the snow, but was speaking and motioning with his hands. Once he pointed at his bandaged foot. Twice he put his hands to his mouth as if to mimic eating. Then he sprang nimbly upon his one foot and would have leaped toward the now raging fire, but the one who had been first impassive, then had attempted to restrain the mad throng, restrained him, for the others, leaping at the fire, threw it hither and yon, stamping out with their feet the blaze that had already begun eating its way into the building. It was all over in a minute. The two girls sank down upon the floor, dizzy and sick, wondering what it was all about. Phi found that to rouse the native from his drunken stupor was no easy task. After rubbing the man's forehead with snow, he stood him on his feet and attempted to compel him to walk. Finding that impossible, he worked his arms back and forth, producing artificial respiration. At last his efforts were rewarded. The man opened his eyes and stared dully at him. For some time he lay there motionless. Then, with a wild light of terror in his eyes, he struggled to his feet and attempted to flee. His wobbly legs would not support him. He tumbled to the earth, only to try it again. Rover ran barking after him. "Let him alone," smiled Phi. "As long as he is not in danger of harming himself, let him work. He's doing as much as we could do for him. He'll work it out of his system." In spite of his muddled state, the fellow appeared to possess a sense of direction, for the boy soon found that he had come upon a narrow path leading along the cliff at a safe distance from its edge. As he stumbled forward, the natives' falls became less frequent. "Sobering up," was Phi's mental thought. "We'll soon strike a place where the path leads down the side of the cliff. I wonder if he can make that alone, or will he break his neck?" Suddenly the man disappeared from view. "That," said Phi to the dog, "means there's a path leading directly down, probably to some village. If it is a village, there are natives there, perhaps hundreds of them. They have seen white men at one time or another. They may have been badly treated by them and may be hostile to them. If one were to judge by the action of this fellow, he must conclude that they are. But that cannot influence our action in any way. If we stay up here and live on birds, they'll find us sooner or later. Might as well go down, the quicker the better, too, for this drunken fellow will doubtless give a weird and terrible account of us." At that he raced along the cliff top path, and the next moment found himself slipping and sliding down a zigzagging trail which led down the hillside. He was halfway down before he caught the first glimpse of the village. Beneath him lay some brown cubes, which he knew to be box-like upper stories of houses of the natives. "That settles one thing," he murmured. "They're islanders. The natives of Russia build their homes on poles, deerskin and walrus skin, tepee fashion. The American natives use logs and sod. Only islanders build them of rocks." For a moment his courage failed him. He was a boy on an island somewhere in the Arctic, his only companion an old and harmless dog, his only weapon a hunting knife, and he was about to enter a village filled with natives. "Perhaps," he said slowly, looking down at the trusted eyes of the dog, "we had better wait. They may all be on a grand spree, and if they are, it won't be safe. Whatever they may be when they're sober, they'll be dangerous enough when they're drunk." But the peaceful quiet of the village as it lay there some hundreds of feet below reassured him. "Come on, old boy," he said at last. "We'll chance it." Chapter 19. Mysteries Explained. There was little time left to the girls for wondering after the fire against the boarded up house had been extinguished, for the entire throng burst in upon them. This time apparently as eager to welcome them as they had been a few minutes before to destroy them, they rushed up to grasp their hands and mumble, "Mikanomuk, Illicanomuk." Soon they all filed out again, two of them bearing the boy with the crushed foot. Only one remained. He was a young Eskimo with a clean-cut, intelligent face. Lucile, by his posture, recognized the one who had championed their cause from the first. "Perhaps you wonder much," he began. "Perhaps you ask how is this? Sit down. I will say it to you." The very sound of their own tongue, badly managed though it might be, was music to the two worn-out and nerve-wrecked girls. They sat down on the sleeping bag to listen, while the yellow light of the seal oil lamp flickered across the dark, expressive face of the Eskimo. He bent over and drew imaginary circles on the floor, one small and one large, just as the boy had done with charcoal. "Here," he smiled, "one island. Here one. This island one house. Here." "Where is this island?" broke in Lucile, too eager to know their position on the shore of the Arctic to hear him through. "Yes," he smiled, "this island is here, very small. This one is here, very large." Again the imaginary circles were drawn. Lucile smiled and was silent. "This one large island," the native went on. "This one plenty Eskimo. Come to visit some Eskimo. Some live here, these Eskimo. Pretty soon come big ice floe. Wanna cross, these people. Can't. Wanna cross, one boy. Try cross. Broke foot, you see. Come house, fell down, think die, that boy. Wanna come in. Pretty soon open door, white women, you. See white women, scared that boy, too much scared. Wanna run that boy, can't. Pretty soon see white woman, good, kind, that one boy. Plenty fix up foot, plenty eat, that boy, wanna stay. Pretty soon come plenty wind, plenty ice. Wanna cross ice all time those Eskimo, now can cross. Cross plenty Eskimo, plenty dog team. Come this island, one little island, see? Where is this island? Lucile broke in again. Yes, the speaker smiled frankly. One big island, one little island. Wanna cross people, all cross people. Again Lucile was silent. Pretty soon, he resumed, see light in along meets white man's house. Wanna know who come island? Look, see two white face in window, two white women. Then pretty much scared. One witch doctor old man, hair all so, he rubbed up his hair. Say that witch doctor, no come white women in this island. Too much ice, no come. Spirits come, that's all. Say that one witch doctor, must kill white woman spirits, must burn house, wanna burn house quick. I say no burn, no spirits maybe, white women maybe. He say that witch doctor, he say no white woman, white spirit, that's all. All people say spirit, spirit, burn, burn, all wanna burn. Me, I wanna stop burn, no can do. Wanna burn. Bring wood, bring oil, all that Eskimo. Pretty soon fire. Wanna come in mine, no can do. By and by come that one boy, rush out a cabin, wanna tell no burn house. No spirit, white women, that's all. No burn, he say that boy, no burn. See white women eat fish, spirits no eat fish. Then all the people say quick, no burn, see no burn, see? That's all. The Eskimo smiled frankly as he mopped the perspiration from his brow. They wanted to burn us because they thought we were spirits, Lucile said slowly. Then suddenly, what do they call this island? This one island. The Eskimo pointed to the floor. Yes, the girls leaned forward eagerly. This one white man call Little Diomede. The two girls stared at one another for a moment, then they laughed. In the laughter there was both surprise and great joy. They were surprised that in all the drifting of their ice floe they had been carried about in a circle and at last landed only 22 miles across ocean from their home on Little Diomede Island, the halfway station between the mainland of America and Russia. "We live at Cape Prince of Wales," said Lucile. "How can we go home?" The Eskimo merely shrugged his shoulder and smiled. "Whose is this house?" asked Marian. "Government," said the Eskimo. "Schoolhouse one time, not now. Not many children. I teach them a little, me. Teach 'em in native house, mine." So there the mystery was solved. They were in a schoolhouse built by the United States government, but which was not now being used. The natives, always very superstitious, having seen their faces through the window, and not believing it possible that any white persons could come to the island at such a time, had, at the suggestion of the old witch doctor, resolved to burn the house in the hopes of driving away the spirits. When the lame boy had limped into their midst and had told how his wound had been dressed by these white women, and how he had seen them eat fish, which no spirit can do, according to the superstition of the Eskimo, they had been quite ready to put out the fire and welcome the strangers, all the more so since the girls had been kind to one in distress. Phi's experience in the village of the island upon which he had been cast was more happy than he could have dreamed of. It turned out that the native who had attacked him was the only drunken person on the island. That it was an island, the Big Diomede, he was immediately informed by a young native who had learned English on a whaler. So it turned out that the two parties, Lucile and Marian and Phi and Rover, had been carried about on the ice floe for 3 days, at last to be landed on Twin Islands. Phi's first thought was of the safety of his former traveling companions. When he learned that nothing had been seen of them on Big Diomede, without pause to rest he pushed on across the solidly frozen mass of ice which silenced the 2 miles of ocean which in summer sweeps between the two islands. It was night when he arrived, the night of the strange witch doctor's seance. This had all come to an end. The schoolhouse was dark, the girls were asleep. From a prowling native he learned that the girls were there and safe, and he turned in for a long sleep. Next day, much to the surprise and delight of the girls, he walked in upon them as they were at breakfast. When the story of all their strange adventures had been told, Phi drew from his pocket a much soiled blue envelope. Phi first told how he had finally come into possession of the letter, then he went on. I guess I may as well tell you about it. It's really no great mystery, no great story of the discovery of gold. Just the locating of a bit of whalebone. You see, my uncle came to the North with $2,000. He stayed 3 years. Then the money was gone and he had found no gold. That happens often, I'm told. Then one day he came upon the carcass of an immense bowhead whale, far north on the Alaskan shore. It had been washed ashore by a storm. No natives lived near. The bone of that whale was worth a small fortune. He cut it out and buried it in the sand dunes near the beach. So eager was he to make good at last that he actually lived on the gristly flesh of that whale until the work was done. Then he went south in search of a gasoline schooner to bring the treasure away. It was worth $4,000 or $5,000. But he had made himself sick. He was brought home from Nome delirious. From his ravings his son, my cousin, gathered some notion of a treasure hid away in Alaska. The doctor said he would recover in time. His family was in need of the money. I offered to come up here and find out what I could. His son was to write me any information he could obtain. We had written to one another letters in Greek while in college. We decided to do it in this case, addressing one another as Phi Beta Ki. Apparently my uncle had said too much in his delirium before he left Nome. This crooked old miner, our bearded friend, heard of it and later somehow got on my trail. You know the rest, except that this letter gives the location of the whalebone. In the spring I shall go after it." As he finished, a great glad feeling of content swept over Marian. She had been right, had made no mistake. The letter was really Phi's. Now he had it and all was well. The following day they succeeded in finding a competent guide to pilot them the remaining distance across the straits, and in due time they arrived safely at the cabin which had been their home. Lucile found a new teacher in her position, but for that she did not care, as she had already decided to spend a month with Marian in Nome, then take the overland trail home. Marian's sketches were received with great enthusiasm by the Society of Ethnology. Because of her extra efforts in securing the unusual pictures of the reindeer Chukches, they added $1,000 to the agreed price. Phi's search for the buried treasure was successful, and to him was given the unselfish joy of seeing his uncle, now completely restored to health, comfortably set up in a snug little business of his own. End of The Blue Envelope, by Roy J. Snell.